the Vigil of the Dead. In a small town in the heart of Georgia, there is a morgue known for housing the bodies of those who died under mysterious circumstances. The morgue, located in the basement of an old hospital built over 80 years ago, has never been renovated. The walls are cold and damp, the lights flicker constantly, and the air always carries a metallic smell, as if the blood has soaked into the very fabric of the place. Tom, a medical student looking for an internship, was assigned to do night shifts at the morgue as part of his training. He had heard the stories about the place, tales of muffled screams, bodies that moved on their own, and an invisible presence that roamed the halls at night. Skeptical and trying to appear confident, Tom didn't let himself be intimidated by the legends. That night, he was alone, just with his clipboard and the sound of the wall clock ticking slowly and disturbingly. The main room of the morgue had a stainless steel table in the center, flanked by metal cabinets where bodies were stored. A large mirror on the wall seemed to reflect the very fear of anyone who dared look into it. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the sound of water dripping from an old pipe. While making his rounds, checking the identification of the bodies in the refrigerated drawers, Tom heard a faint noise. It sounded like a moan coming from one of the drawers at the back of the room. He hesitated for a moment, thinking he might have imagined it, but the sound came again, louder this time. Heart pounding, he moved towards the drawer where the sound seemed to be coming from. When he pulled it open, he found the body of an elderly man who had been brought in that morning after being found dead at home, apparently from natural causes. But something was wrong. The corpse's eyes were open and its mouth moved slightly as if trying to speak. Tom instinctively backed away, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Suddenly, the body jerked upright, sitting up in the drawer, eyes fixed on the ceiling, lips trembling.
"They're taking me! Help me!"
the corpse said, with a guttural voice that should not have been possible from a dead body. Tom fell back, terrified, but couldn't take his eyes off the scene. The body began to convulse, as if being pulled by invisible forces. Before he could react, the lights in the morgue flickered and went out completely. In the darkness, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, followed by whispered laughter that seemed to come from all directions. When the lights came back on, the body was lying back in the drawer as if nothing had happened. Trembling, Tom tried to rationalize what he saw. It must be stress, lack of sleep, he murmured to himself. But the horrors of that night were just beginning. In the hours that followed, he heard the sound of drawers opening and closing on their own, saw shadows moving in the corners of his vision, and more than once felt cold fingers touch his shoulder when no one was there. As he reviewed the records of the dead for that night, he noticed something disturbing. The names of the bodies were crossed out, as if someone had tried to erase them in anger. When he went back to check the drawers, he realized that 2 bodies were missing. When he tried to leave the morgue, he found the door locked, and the smell of decay in the air became unbearable. Desperate, he began pounding on the door and screaming for help, but was met only with the echo of his own voice. When he turned around, he saw something that froze his blood. The bodies of the 2 missing dead were standing in the middle of the room, watching him. Their faces were disfigured, with expressions of pain and rage, and their mouths murmured something unintelligible. Tom tried to back away, but his body was paralyzed by fear. The figures slowly approached, whispering, "Why did you leave us here? It's cold. So cold." Suddenly, he felt a grip on his neck, as if invisible hands were trying to strangle him. In the mirror in front of him, he saw the reflection of several shadowy figures around him, all with hollow faces and black eyes, fixated on his suffering. The next morning, when the hospital staff arrived, they found Tom unconscious on the floor with handprints around his neck. He was taken to the emergency room but was never the same again. No one could convince him to return to the morgue, and the stories about the place only grew darker. The few who still work there say that during the early hours, whispers and knocks can be heard coming from the drawers, as if the dead were trying to escape from something far worse than death itself.
The final farewell. In a small town deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the municipal morgue carries a heavy, unsettling atmosphere. The building, constructed at the beginning of the 20th century, has a Gothic architecture with tall arches and stained glass windows that lost their luster long ago. The stone walls are covered with moss, and the trees around have twisted branches like skeletal hands pointing to the sky, swaying at the slightest touch of the wind. Here, death seems more than a final state. It is a living presence, almost tangible. The morgue is known in the region for housing bodies of people who died alone, with no one to claim their remains. These bodies stay there, awaiting total oblivion, until they are finally buried in unmarked graves. It's a place where silence and cold reign, where loneliness echoes in the empty corridors. And John was the guardian of this place. John had been in charge of the morgue for over 20 years. A reserved man with little to no social contact outside of work, he prided himself on the meticulous routine he kept. Every hallway impeccably clean, every drawer neatly closed. He spent the nights tending to the structure, ensuring that the dead had their final rest in peace. But over the years, small details began to bother him. Doors he had locked appeared ajar, objects moved without explanation, and a chilling sensation settled in certain parts of the morgue, even on the hottest days. These oddities intensified with the arrival of the body of Mrs. Elvira, a reclusive elderly woman who lived alone in a remote house. She was found dead, sitting in her rocking chair, with a frozen expression of pure terror on her face. There were no signs of violence, but everyone in town whispered that something was wrong with the way she died. From the day Mrs. Elvira's body arrived, John noticed changes in the atmosphere of the morgue. The once silent hallways now seemed to whisper his name, and the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. John's nights became disturbing. He started having strange, distressing dreams. In one of them, he walked down a never-ending, dimly lit hallway with the walls closing in around him. Always at the end of the hallway there was a door, and behind it a skeletal figure cloaked in shadows awaited him. A macabre smile stretched across a fleshless face, with empty eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. One of the coldest nights of the year, while making his nightly rounds, John heard a strange sound. It was the creaking of a rocking chair coming from one of the rooms where bodies were prepared. His heart raced. He knew there was no such furniture in the morgue. Still, the sound persisted, almost hypnotic. He followed the noise to the room. When he opened the door, he found the room empty. However, the sound continued, echoing ghostly, as if an invisible chair were being rocked. And then he saw it, projected on the wall by a light that did not exist, the shadow of a chair rocking alone. A shiver ran down his spine. Something was very wrong. Disturbed, John decided to dig deeper into Mrs. Elvira's past. He went to the morgue's archive and discovered she had spent part of her life in a psychiatric hospital. In the records, there were notes about her insistence that she was being pursued by lost souls who came to her house every night, whispering her name, begging for help. The doctors diagnosed it as dementia, but John began to believe there was something much darker. That very night, when he returned to the morgue, he was met by an intense cold. The lights, already unreliable, flickered more than usual, and then he heard them. Whispers coming from all directions, muffled voices as if distant, yet too close to ignore. "Help us! We can't leave!" Determined to end this, John headed to the room where Mrs. Elvira's body was stored. When he opened the refrigerated drawer, he was overcome with an inexplicable terror. The body was in a completely different position from how he had left it. Mrs. Elvira was sitting up, her eyes open, staring into nothingness, and her mouth formed a crooked, macabre smile. The air grew heavy, and a smell of mold mixed with something sweet, almost rotten, filled his nostrils. At that moment, John heard a dragged voice, almost a whisper. "I warned you they would come." Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with a bang, plunging the environment into total darkness. John, heart pounding, tried to reach the exit, but he couldn't open the door. It was as if something or someone was pressing against it from the other side, keeping him trapped. In the dark, he felt cold hands touch his face, like bony, icy fingers scratching his skin. The sound of nails scraping the walls intensified, creating a terrifying cacophony. Desperate, he turned back to the drawer, and what he saw made him scream in pure terror. Mrs. Elvira was standing beside the table, her body bent in an impossible way. Her eyes were hollow like dark holes, and from her mouth came a low, continuous wail.
"I just wanted peace, but now you're trapped too."
When the lights returned, John was alone in the room. His legs trembled so much he could barely stand. He ran out of the morgue without looking back. That same night, he submitted his resignation and left town, never to return. Months later, other staff members reported sensing strange presences in the morgue. Some said they heard the sound of a rocking chair creaking softly, as if someone were seated in their eternal rest. The reports continued. Some said if you listened closely during the dead of night, you could hear Mrs. Elvira's lament, begging to be freed from the torment of her post-mortem existence. Others swore they saw shadows dancing on the walls, like invisible figures accompanying the old woman in her suffering. Since then, the morgue has become a place avoided even by the bravest. The townspeople know that at night the building is ruled by something far beyond comprehension, something lurking in the shadows, waiting to take those who dare disturb the dead's rest.
The wrong body. In the basement of a large old hospital in Chicago, there's a morgue that most people in the city don't even know exists. Its location is deliberately discreet. After all, nobody wants to think too much about what happens down there. The walls are made of bare concrete with no windows, and the fluorescent lights buzz and flicker occasionally. It's a cold place, where the air feels heavy, almost as if death is woven into the walls. The morgue is run by a small team, but it's John, the night security guard, who spends the most time there. John is a middle-aged man with tired features, his routine filled with long rounds through the dark corridors, ensuring that everything is in order. He was used to the silence, the solitude, and the metallic smell of the environment. But one specific night, something out of the ordinary happened. A tragic mistake that unleashed a series of supernatural events. It all started with the arrival of 2 bodies on the same day. A young criminal who died in a shootout with the police, and an elderly man who had passed away at a nursing home. Somehow, the body tags were switched, and the criminal was identified as the elderly man, and vice versa. While the young criminal was given a proper, dignified burial, the elderly man's body remained in the morgue, awaiting an unnecessary autopsy. To many, it was just an administrative mistake, but for John, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. In the nights that followed, John began to notice changes in the morgue's atmosphere. The air seemed colder, and a foul smell he couldn't identify permeated the halls. But what really unnerved him was the constant feeling of being watched. During his rounds, he often felt a pair of eyes on his back, but when he turned around, all he found was darkness and silence. One early morning, while monitoring the security cameras, John saw something that made him hold his breath. One of the cold storage drawers, where the elderly man's body was still kept, slowly opened with no one nearby. From inside the drawer, a dark, misty figure began to emerge. John rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a transmission error, but the figure continued to move, coming out of the drawer with stiff, unsettling motions. It was a human silhouette, but its edges were blurred and indistinct, as if it existed somewhere between this world and the next. Terrified, John rushed to the room to check what was happening. When he arrived, everything appeared normal. The drawer was closed, and the room looked exactly as he had left it, but the trail of moisture on the floor and the marks of bare feet left him with no logical explanation. Something had indeed come out. In the days that followed, the phenomena only got worse. John began to hear soft, almost imperceptible wails echoing through the empty corridors. He tried to ignore them, but the voices seemed to follow him wherever he went, whispering things like, "This isn't my place," and "Why was I left behind?" The situation reached its peak when, upon checking the elderly man's body, John noticed something that chilled his blood. The corpse's eyes were open, and the face had an expression of anger. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and as John approached, he felt the lips move, forming the words, "He shouldn't be resting. Not in my place." That same night, the morgue was overwhelmed by an inexplicable energy. The lights began to flicker uncontrollably, and the sound of doors slamming echoed throughout the building. Desperate, John returned to the security cameras and saw a scene that made him question his sanity. The misty figure was back, this time walking down the corridors with dragging steps as if searching for something or someone. The air in the morgue grew unbearably heavy. John began to struggle to breathe, feeling as if an invisible hand was squeezing his chest. Then the figure turned to face the camera, and for a moment its eyes locked directly onto his. Those empty eyes seemed to overflow with hatred and pain. "You messed with what you shouldn't have. You brought death to the wrong place." A raspy voice echoed in John's head, making him fall to his knees, sweating cold. He tried to leave the morgue, but the main door was locked, as if something were holding it shut from the outside. Suddenly, all the drawers in the cold storage flew open at once, and a freezing wind began to blow through the room. The lights flickered rapidly, and John saw something that made him scream in terror. All the bodies were standing outside their drawers, forming a circle around the autopsy table. In the center of the circle, the misty figure materialized again, laughing softly, with a sound that seemed to mix pain and pleasure. John finally managed to unlock the door and ran out of the morgue, not looking back. He quit his job that very night and never returned. Days later, the hospital administration was informed of the incident and decided to conduct an investigation. The elderly man's body was finally buried, but the strange reports did not cease. New employees began to report hearing dragging footsteps and distant wails in the middle of the night, as if something were seeking justice for being left behind. The case was hushed up, and the morgue remains in operation, but few have the courage to work the night shift. The stories of a wandering body and a guard tormented by past mistakes are whispered, and no one dares ignore the rules about who belongs in which grave.
The Body Swap Location, a small coastal town in Maine. In a quiet, old-fashioned coastal town in Maine, there is a municipal morgue near the local cemetery. A weathered building with dusty windows and creaky walls that sway with the wind. The place, forgotten by many, holds a disturbing story, marked by a grotesque mistake that unleashed supernatural events. It all began when two bodies arrived at the morgue on the same day. One belonged to a young criminal, killed in a gang fight, and the other to a beloved elderly woman from the community. Due to an inexplicable oversight, their body tags were switched. The criminal was buried with honors, while the elderly woman's body remained in the morgue, awaiting an unnecessary autopsy. Sam, the coroner in charge, discovered the mistake days later. When he realized what had happened, he felt an overwhelming sense of discomfort. Something in the morgue had changed. The place, which had always been cold and silent, now seemed alive, pulsing with a dark energy. One night, while working late to correct the documentation, Sam heard a sound that made him stop. It was faint but persistent, rhythmic knocking coming from one of the cold storage drawers. He tried to ignore it, but something pushed him to investigate.
It must be my imagination.
Sam muttered to himself, but doubt was already planted in his mind. With trembling hands, he opened the drawer. There lay the elderly woman's body, but something was terribly wrong. Her eyes, which he was sure had been closed, were now open, staring at him with a dull glare. The serene expression had been replaced by a grimace of hatred. Her mouth was slightly open, and Sam swore he heard a faint, drawn-out whisper.
"He shouldn't rest like this. Not in my place."
Sam backed away, terrified. He slammed the drawer shut, trying to ignore the chill running up his spine.
It's just exhaustion,
he repeated to himself, trying to rationalize. But the morgue seemed to have a life of its own. The lights began to flicker, and the shadows on the walls contorted strangely, as if gaining shape. Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the corridor. They were light, dragging footsteps, as if someone were wandering aimlessly. Cold sweat trickled down Sam's neck.
Who's there?
He shouted, more out of the need to hear his own voice than expecting a response. But what he heard in response was a low, dark laugh, seeming to come from all directions. Trembling, he followed the sound to the autopsy room. The lights flickered frantically, and then he saw her. The elderly woman was standing by the autopsy table. Her head hung to the side at an impossible angle, as if broken. Her eyes, empty and dark, stared at him with a mix of sadness and anger.
"I was at peace. Why was I switched? Now no one rests."
Her voice was a chilling whisper, laden with bitterness. Sam could barely breathe. He was paralyzed by fear, unable to look away from the spectral figure. Then, all the drawers in the cold storage began to open and close violently, as if being manipulated by an invisible force. The noise was deafening, and the lights finally went out, plunging the room into total darkness. In the pitch black, he felt a cold hand grip his arm. When the lights returned, the elderly woman was right in front of him, her mouth moving as she murmured,
"You need to fix this.
Desperate, Sam fled the room, but the sound of the drawers still echoed in his ears like a trail of footsteps pursuing him. He ran to the morgue exit, locking the door behind him, but the terror did not end there. That night, at home, he dreamed of the old woman, who whispered repeatedly,
Fix the mistake or no one will rest.
The next day, Sam managed to arrange for the exhumation of the wrong body, and the exchange was finally made. During the process, he felt as though he was being watched the entire time. The air around him seemed lighter, but he knew he would never forget what happened. After the correction, the phenomena in the morgue diminished, but they never ceased entirely. New employees whisper that they still feel inexplicable chills and hear faint knocks in the middle of the night. Some claim to see a vague figure in the corridors, watching from a distance, as if ensuring no more mistakes are made.
This place has its rules.
Sam would often say to new hires,
Treat the dead with respect. A mistake here is not just a mistake. It can trap souls in eternal torment.
The Watchman, from the other side, Carlos, was the night watchman at a morgue in a small town in upstate New York. For over a decade, he held the same position, making solitary rounds through dark and silent corridors where the only sound was the echo of his own footsteps. He knew every corner of the place and always said the same thing when asked if he was afraid. The dead don't harm anyone, it's the living that worry me. That confidence began to waver on one particularly cold winter night. A body was brought to the morgue from a brutal crime scene. The man, about 40 years old, had been murdered violently. Even after death, his face displayed a frozen expression of terror, as if he had seen something horrifying in his final moments. The most disturbing detail was the vacant, fixed stare that seemed to follow anyone who got close. From the moment this body arrived, Carlos began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in the environment. The lights, which had only flickered occasionally, now failed more frequently. A constant sound, like the ticking of a clock, echoed through the halls, although Carlos knew there was no clock there.
What the hell is going on?
He muttered to himself during one of his rounds. One early morning, while walking through the cold corridors, Carlos passed by the cold storage room and noticed that one of the drawers was slightly ajar. He frowned. He was sure that all the drawers had been properly closed before his shift began. As he approached, he heard a faint sound, like heavy breathing coming from inside the drawer. Carlos hesitated. His instinct told him to ignore it and move on, but curiosity got the best of him. Slowly, he pulled the drawer open. When the drawer was fully open, he froze at what he saw. The body of the man was standing upright, eyes fixed on him, with a macabre smile spreading across the pale face. Those eyes, once opaque and lifeless, were now full of intense rage. "You're on the wrong side, Carlos." The voice that echoed through the room was low and raspy, as if the words were being dragged through damaged vocal cords. "They sent me here, but I shouldn't be alone." Carlos backed away, paralyzed with fear. He blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. When his eyes opened again, the body was lying down, still as it should be. The smile was gone, and the eyes were closed. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself that it had been a hallucination caused by exhaustion.
I need more sleep.
He whispered to himself, still trembling, but the nightmare was just beginning. Later that same night, Carlos decided to review the security footage. He wanted to prove to himself that nothing was wrong, but what he saw made his blood run cold. On the screen, a dark, distorted, faceless figure was walking through the morgue's corridors. The most terrifying part was that it moved with the same posture as him, as if it were mimicking his every step. The figure stopped in front of doors, looked into rooms, exactly as Carlos did during his rounds.
What is this?
He stammered, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen. The figure approached one of the cameras, and Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. Even without a face, he had the clear sensation that he was being watched. Then a whisper echoed in his mind, coming from all directions. "You watch for us now. Your time is running out." Carlos stood up abruptly, knocking over the chair. His heart was racing, and he felt his legs grow heavy, as if being pulled to the ground. He tried to leave the room, but his steps were slow, as if he were walking through a nightmare. Suddenly he stopped when he saw a dark shadow reflected in a mirror at the end of the corridor. It was the same figure he had seen on the cameras, but now it was more defined, and what he saw made his heart nearly stop. The shadow had a face, his face, only distorted, with a twisted, sinister smile like an evil reflection.
This can't be happening. This can't be real.
Carlos repeated, his voice trembling. But the ticking sound grew louder, filling the entire morgue. He looked around the walls, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was no clock. Desperate, he ran to the security room, but the lights began to flicker uncontrollably, and he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw his own shadow approaching, the sinister smile even more pronounced. The next day, his colleagues found Carlos locked in the security room, mumbling incoherently.
The other side, it's so close, so close.
He was removed from his position, and no one saw him again in town. Some say he fled far away, while others believe he was swallowed by the morgue itself, trapped between two worlds. Since then, the morgue has gained a reputation for having a watchman from the other side. New employees report seeing Carlos's shadow wandering the corridors, performing an endless round, as if trapped in an eternal cycle. And they say that when the clock strikes exactly 3 a.m, you can hear the sound of ticking, like an invisible clock that never stops, and if you stay perfectly silent, you might even hear the whisper, "Your time is coming."